Margaret Walker was 72 when her own son told her to leave. No raised voices, no tears, just a quiet sentence, spoken with a coldness that pierced her soul, a turn back, and the soft click of a door closing behind her. It didn't slam. It didn't need to. Sometimes silence has the sharpest edge. She stood on the front steps of the house she used to help pay for, holding a worn suitcase and wearing the same winter coat she'd owned for 15 years. Her grip on the handle was so tight, you'd think she was carrying her entire life inside. Her hands trembled, each shake a silent scream of betrayal. Maybe she was. Her son Eric stood at the threshold with his arms crossed. His eyes avoided hers. "We've got kids, Mom," he said, his voice flat. "Brittany and we just can't take care of everyone. You're not working anymore, we're sorry." Behind him, Brittany leaned against the doorframe with a thin smile. Her expression was a mask, hiding triumph behind feigned pity. One of those expressions people wear when they finally get what they want, but don't want to say it out loud. Margaret didn't protest. She didn't cry. She simply gave a small nod and turned to walk down the steps. Each step felt like wading through the weight of her son's rejection. No one offered to help. No one asked where she would go. She'd once skipped her own meals so Eric could buy his first set of college textbooks. She'd worked night shifts at motels, scrubbed hospital floors, and spent decades being the one who made sure he never had to know hunger. And now she was being sent away like an unwanted guest. Her suitcase dragged along the concrete, making a slow scraping sound. It echoed like her heart breaking, a cruel dirge for her sacrifice. It felt like the sidewalk itself was whispering a cruel farewell. "You're on your own now." What Eric didn't know, what nobody knew, was that tucked inside Margaret's purse was a debit card, a key, one connected to a hidden bank account that held something she had never spoken of out loud. $1,400,000, 0 cents. A secret she'd guarded fiercely, a spark of power she'd kept from a world that deemed her worthless. And still, she walked away quietly. Not because she had to, but because she had finally decided she deserved something more than the small corner she had been forced to live in. She deserved peace. Margaret didn't cry. Not when she stepped off the porch, not when her knees began to ache halfway down Brighton Avenue, not when the sting of Eric's words replayed like a relentless drum in her mind, and not when she sat on the cold metal bench at the bus stop, 3 blocks from the house that used to be hers. She simply sat there, coat buttoned up to her chin, both hands folded over her purse like it held the last warmth in the world. She didn't need sympathy. She had something else. Inside that worn leather purse was a debit card, smooth from years of disuse but powerful nonetheless. It was connected to a trust fund that quietly held over $1,400,000, 0 cents. Money that no one, not even Eric, knew existed. Years ago, after her husband died in a construction accident, the insurance payout had been modest, barely enough to get them by, but tucked inside the envelope, along with the paperwork and condolences, was a deed. 40 acres of dry, empty land in the far northeast corner of the state, a forgotten inheritance from a great-uncle Margaret barely remembered. People told her to sell it. "It's worthless," they said. "No water, no electricity, no paved road, just dirt." At the time, she considered it. God knows she needed the money, but something in her told her to hold on, so she did. Every year, even when money was tight, even when she had to choose between paying taxes on that land or fixing the heater in their tiny rental apartment, she chose the land just in case. Then last autumn, a man in a press suit had shown up at the church where she volunteered. He said he worked for a solar development firm. They were looking to expand their project, and that particular stretch of land, dry, sun-soaked, and untouched, was perfect for their needs. Margaret had asked him just one question: "Can this transaction remain private?" 3 weeks later, the money appeared in a trust fund under her late husband's name. No announcements, no changes to her modest lifestyle. To the world, she was still Miss Margaret, the quiet church volunteer in second-hand sweaters. But now she carried something far heavier and far more powerful than anyone could see. She carried a quiet vengeance. a resolve to rise above the dismissal of those who'd cast her aside. She carried freedom. For most of her life, Margaret had been invisible, not to herself, but to the world around her, to the people who passed by as she cleaned motel bathrooms at midnight, to the nurses who never looked her in the eye when she scrubbed their hospital floors, and later, to her own family. She had spent decades giving up, giving away. She gave Eric her time, her health, her hopes. After her husband died, she didn't have the luxury of grieving. She had a 6-year-old who needed breakfast, school supplies, and someone to remind him he was safe. She became that someone every day, without fail. She packed lunches when there was barely anything in the fridge. She walked to work so Eric could ride the bus to school. She cut her hair short because it was cheaper, and when he graduated college, she clapped louder than anyone in the crowd, proud, not bitter. But now, sitting at that bus stop bench with a purse full of quiet wealth, she understood something she never dared to say before. The hardest part of motherhood wasn't the sacrifice. It was the silence afterward. The erasure. The way Eric's refusal to meet her eyes had stripped her of decades of love in a single moment. The way the very people you gave everything to no longer saw you, not really. They saw your wrinkles, your slowness, your fading usefulness, but not your worth. Eric hadn't looked her in the eyes when he asked her to leave. He didn't want to see what he was doing. That would have made it real. That would have made it wrong. But Margaret had learned to survive long before this. She had known hunger. She had known how it felt to count quarters in a dim kitchen while pretending the flickering light bulb wasn't a problem. She had known the ache of exhaustion that doesn't leave, even after sleep. But she had never known this. The feeling of being cast aside by her own son. A wound so deep it threatened to drown her, yet fueled her to reclaim her dignity. And still, she didn't hate him. She couldn't. That wasn't who she was. Hate would have only tied her to him more tightly. Instead, she reached into her purse and pulled out an old folded paper. The deed. She smoothed it flat on her lap and stared at the faded ink like it was a map. Because maybe it was. That evening, Margaret didn't book a hotel. She didn't call anyone. Instead, she walked 3 more blocks to a women's shelter she had once donated to in her working years. It wasn't out of desperation, it was a choice. She wanted to sit with people who wouldn't ask about her bank account or where her son was. She wanted to be around others who understood what it meant to be forgotten. Inside, she shared the crackers and granola bars she had tucked away in her bag. She listened to a woman cry over a daughter who never called back. She laughed gently when someone told a joke about socks never matching at the shelter. And for the first time in a long time, Margaret felt seen, her heart stirring with a warmth she'd thought was lost forever. The next morning, she boarded a bus to the edge of a small rural town she had only visited once, decades ago. She asked the driver to drop her near Grove Street, where an old cottage had been sitting empty for years. She found it exactly as she remembered from the photo, cracked windows, peeling paint, and weeds taller than the mailbox. It looked like it had given up. But Margaret hadn't. She paid in cash. No mortgage, no fuss, just a quiet transaction under the name of a newly registered LLC, Meadowgrace Holdings. 3 weeks later, the house was transformed. Fresh white paint, a new roof, wildflowers along the walkway, and solar panels shining in the sun. No one in town knew who owned it, and that was exactly how Margaret wanted it. She didn't want Eric or Brittany to show up one day with apologies that smelled like regret. She didn't want the neighbors to whisper about how the old church lady got rich overnight. She didn't want revenge. She wanted peace. And even more than that, she wanted purpose. A burning drive to create something that would outlast her pain. So she began walking around town quietly, carefully asking questions at food pantries, youth centers, and shelters. What did they need? Where were the leaks? What supplies were missing? And one by one she began fixing them. A roof here, a heater there, an anonymous donation to replace the broken stove at the youth home. She never signed her name, because what she was building didn't need to be about her, it needed to be about hope. A month later, she found it. Tucked behind a shuttered hardware store was an old brick building, once a community hall, now boarded up and forgotten. The windows were cracked, the front door jammed, and weeds split the sidewalk out front. Most people saw an eyesore. Margaret saw a beginning, a chance to turn her betrayal into a beacon for others. She bought the property under Meadowgrace Holdings and began renovations immediately. She hired local workers, paid fair wages, and stayed out of the spotlight. No interviews, no public announcements, just quiet progress. By early spring, the building was reborn. Fresh siding, restored wood floors, a kitchen that gleamed, soft lighting, foldable tables, blankets stacked neatly in corners, a quiet piano by the back wall. Outside, the garden bloomed with marigolds and rosemary, sunflowers taller than any child. She named it Margaret's Table. No one was turned away. There were no forms, no questions. If you needed a meal, you got one. If you needed rest, you found it. If you needed someone to sit with you while you stared at your shaking hand, someone would. Margaret poured herself into the work, not out of grief, not even out of anger, but because, for the first time in her life, she was building something that reflected who she really was. Not a background figure, not a mother on standby, but a creator of safe places, a woman whose quiet strength would echo through generations. And she made sure it would last beyond her. She partnered with local schools to host free dinners. She stocked the pantry with essentials and quietly paid rent for struggling single parents who visited the center. The staff never knew where the money came from. Margaret preferred it that way. One night, a woman sat at the table with a bruised arm and 2 children curled against her. As they ate hot soup and homemade cornbread, she looked up and whispered, "I haven't felt safe in a long time." Margaret nodded, her hand resting lightly on the table between them, her heart swelling with the knowledge she'd turned her own pain into their refuge. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. In that moment, she understood something deep and quiet. Love doesn't always look like rescue. Sometimes it's simply a seat at the table when the rest of the world has shut its doors. And Margaret? She'd spent a lifetime waiting outside those doors. Now she was building her own and keeping them open. While Margaret's table was blooming with warmth and quiet dignity, life elsewhere was falling apart. Eric lost the house 6 months after his mother left. At first, it was just small things. Late utility bills, missed credit card payments, notices from the bank that Brittany conveniently hid in a kitchen drawer. But debt has a way of growing in the shadows. Eventually, the foreclosure letter arrived. Then came the locks changed by strangers. Brittany packed the kids into her sister's SUV and said she needed stability. Eric watched them drive away with a duffel bag and a box of cereal that was supposed to last the week. He tried side gigs, warehouse shifts, online delivery apps, even pawned the guitar he swore he'd never sell. But nothing stuck. There was always another bill, another call from a number he didn't want to answer. Eventually, he ended up in a friend's basement, sleeping on a cot beside a stack of unopened Amazon boxes. He shared meals with cockroaches in silence. What hurt most wasn't the hardship. It was the echo of something he hadn't let himself remember. The sound of his mother leaving without protest, a memory that clawed at him, whispering he'd destroyed the one who loved him most. One rainy afternoon, desperate for a warm place to sit, Eric ducked into the public library. It had been years since he'd stepped into one. He wandered the shelves numbly, unsure what he was looking for, until he saw a flyer near the front desk. Cream-colored paper, elegant script, a small wooden logo carved with leaves. Margaret's Table. Meals, shelter, support, no one left behind. His breath caught. He read the name again and again. Margaret. He tried to tell himself it couldn't be her, couldn't be his mother, but the ache in his chest said otherwise, a gnawing guilt that threatened to break him. He stared at the address. He had passed that street 100 times and never looked twice, and now, for the first time in 2 years, something stirred. Guilt, maybe, or hope, or just the last thread of a rope he hadn't realized he was clinging to. The next morning, he walked across town in shoes that led in water, each step heavy with dread and the faint hope of redemption. He turned the corner and there it was, a building framed by wild flowers, fresh paint, laughter spilling out from an open window, and above the door, carved in smooth, dark wood, were the words, "Margaret's Table. Everyone has a place." Eric stepped inside. Unsure if his legs would hold, he was greeted not by security or suspicion, but by warmth, real, living warmth. The kind that smelled like fresh bread and sounded like dishes being stacked gently by hands that cared. The lobby was quiet, peaceful. A volunteer with kind eyes handed him a towel for the rain. She didn't ask questions, just smiled. Then he saw her behind the reception desk in a beige cardigan and sensible shoes, her silver hair tucked behind her ears. "Margaret." She looked up. Their eyes met. For a second, neither moved. The room seemed to hold its breath. Eric's throat tightened, his lips parted, but nothing came out. "I didn't know where else to go," he whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of his shame. Margaret stood slowly and walked around the desk. She didn't hurry. She didn't hesitate. She stopped just in front of him. Eric looked down at the floor. "I lost the house," he said. Brittany laughed. I have nothing." Silence. Then Margaret spoke, her voice steady, soft. "Come inside. You look cold." She led him to a corner table, set a steaming mug of tea in front of him and sat across. The room moved around them, volunteers, soft music, the clink of spoons, but they were still. "This place, it's yours?" Eric asked. She nodded. "I thought you had nothing," he said. Margaret smiled faintly. "I had peace and enough." His voice cracked. "Why didn't you tell me that you were okay, that you had money?" She looked at him gently. "Would it have changed anything?" He didn't answer. "I needed to know who would stay when I had nothing left to give," she said. "That's how I knew who to build this for." Eric's shoulders sank. "I was awful to you," he whispered. "You trusted me and I threw you out." His words were a confession, raw and desperate, begging for a forgiveness he felt he didn't deserve. Margaret reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "You forgot yourself," she said. "That doesn't mean you can't find your way back." And in that moment, Eric cried not in loud sobs, but in quiet streams of tears that slipped down his cheeks and dropped onto the table. It was the kind of crying that comes from shame, from relief, from a love that never stopped waiting. It was the beginning of something healing. Spring came slowly that year. Soft rains felt like forgiveness. Daffodils pushed through tired soil, and in the garden behind Margaret's table, children chased each other beneath rows of fluttering prayer flags and tall sunflowers. Eric showed up every day. He never asked to be paid. He just came, fixed broken chairs, sorted canned goods, repaired leaky pipes. He didn't say much, but in the way he scrubbed the floor or carried boxes without being asked, something unspoken was being mended. Each task was a silent apology, a vow to become the son she deserved. Margaret didn't speak of the past. She didn't need to. Every Friday evening they sat side by side on the front porch, sipping warm cider as the sun dipped behind the rooftops. No guilt, no apologies, just presence. One such evening she handed him a sealed envelope. Eric opened it, puzzled. Inside was the original deed to the house she had once given him, alongside a voided check from the land she had sold. They were framed together under a single sheet of glass. He looked at her, speechless. "You don't owe me anything," Margaret said, her eyes soft but sure. "But now you know what happens when love comes before pride." He nodded, unable to speak. For the first time in his life he saw her not just as mom, but as a woman who had been broken, forgotten, underestimated, and yet chose kindness over revenge, a beacon whose grace had saved him from his own darkness. That fall, Margaret passed away quietly in her sleep. There were no headlines, no dramatic eulogies, just a small wooden service attended by over 100 people. People from the shelters, schools, soup kitchens, and corners of the community she had touched. Eric stood at the front holding her favorite apron, the one she always wore when cooking for others. "My mother left a house once," he said softly, "with nothing but a suitcase and a quiet heart. But in that silence, she built something bigger than any of us ever knew. He turned toward the doorway. Carved into the arch above it were words Margaret had chosen herself the day the center opened. So the doors that close behind you can never match the ones you open for others. And Eric, once angry, once blind, had become the man his mother always believed he could be, redeemed by her love that refused to falter. Not because she had money, but because she chose grace over resentment and forgiveness over pride. If this story moved you, take a moment to like, share, or comment below, because sometimes the quietest people leave behind the loudest legacies.